am Kelly Kirksey.
And I am Jeremiah Childers.
Welcome to the Lenten podcast.
Today we are going to be talking about sacrifice in our first week of Lent. But before we do that, let's talk about Lent in general. So Kelly, when you think about Lent, what is the first thing that comes to your mind?
Prayer.
Prayer.
I don't really know why. Maybe it's because we talked about it in our intergenerational groups last week, and I just thought that was a perfect way to segue into Lent. But prayer, and then also like giving something up.
Okay.
You know, that's always the question when Lent starts is, what are you giving up? My youth keep asking me. I think they're like, I'm like, I don't want to tell them. They're going to trap me, you know, that they're going to see me doing what I gave up, and then they'll be like, Miss Kelly, you know. So.
Well, in college was the first time I'd heard anything about the season of Lent, and it wasn't until like weeks later I finally had the nerve up and say, what does Lent mean? Is that what's like on your clothes? Is that what's in your belly button?
Oh, yeah.
They were like, no.
You didn't ask about the belly button for real, did you?
I don't remember.
I hope not. That would be like, what a weirdo.
But Lent is just another word that comes from an Old English word that means springtime or spring. So it is this season of spring that we prepare 40 days to Holy Week of Easter. And it is kind of modeled after Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness as he is tempted and as he fasts and as he prays. So for hundreds of years, the church at large has spent time during this season fasting, praying, almsgiving.
Wait. What is almsgiving? Jeremiah using these big words that nobody really uses anymore. So let us know, what is almsgiving?
Well, do you remember the cartoon Robin Hood? And you have the poor people out there giving alms, you know.
Oh, yes, they did. Yeah. They said, alms to the poor, alms to the poor.
So it is giving money or giving offerings, not just to God, but also to those in need. And this season is a season of reflection, a season to examine one's own sin, one's own temptation, and anything that would lead us away from God.
Yeah.
And part of that is as we draw closer to God, we also reflect on our own mortality. So Ash Wednesday is this week. And as we come to Ash Wednesday service, we'll hear that out of the Genesis text, we are dust, and to dust we will return. And when we contemplate our own mortality, we realize that we are only given a certain amount of days in life.
Yeah.
And we should use those moments in life, if we've not committed fully to God, to repent, to turn to God, and to live out our lives more fully as God's children.
Yeah.
And for me, anytime I think about my own mortality, it's not a question of, am I afraid to die? But I'm oftentimes worried about not getting to live. So reflecting on it makes me live more fully, more intentionally.
Yeah.
So this year, our theme, even before we came to the season of Lent, in our worship services, have been around being children of God. So as we go through the season of Lent, one of the questions hopefully we'll reflect on is, how are we growing to be more like our Heavenly Parent, God? And also, as we grow as God's children, are we maturing?
Right.
And in our maturity, are we seeing some of the themes that we'll see over the next weeks, like today's sacrifice, in a much more mature way of thinking about who God is, what God's doing, and how do we relate to God and relate to others?
Yeah, I think it's important, you know, that we understand that these themes a lot of times we've heard before, you know, but hopefully in growing, we do this in the children's ministry where we will tell the same story over and over again, but it's because you hear it as an 8-year-old and you understand it one way, you hear it as a 12-year-old and your understanding is totally different. And hopefully you've matured spiritually. So hopefully, you know, last year we think about repentance, we think about Ash Wednesday, we think about sacrifice, and this year we understand it differently because we have grown spiritually, right? That's kind of the hope.
That's right. And one of the things in our first Lenten devotion, for those that are able to read that as well, we talk about what does it mean to grow up and not understand how much sacrifice our parents give.
Yeah.
And then as we become parents and as we have children, we not only appreciate our parents' sacrifices, but now we know what it is to sacrifice for another.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the perspectives I want us to see is how much does God sacrifice for us, especially in Jesus, and how do we receive that sacrifice and then say to ourselves, how can we live that out for others?
Mm-hmm.
How can we offer a similar way of understanding that sacrifice is always, if it is done appropriately, is always centered in love?
Right.
The agape kind of love that says to oneself, the other, I want to put the other before myself.
Yeah, where it's not a conditional sacrifice, where it's not, hey, I'm going to give this up knowing that one day I'm going to need something from you.
Yeah.
Because that's, I think, how we work in our society, in our world. It's the way we think, is transactionally.
Yeah.
But God is saying, no, like this is a sacrifice out of pure love. And there is no expectation.
No expectation. Or also kind of the other mentality that's in some of our culture, especially in some Christian circles, about a prosperity gospel, where if you give, you'll receive in abundance more.
Right. Like, I'm going to give my $5, but I know I'm going to get 15 back.
Yeah.
Right?
And my thing would be, is that really love? Or is that just a way of trying to...
That's not really sacrifice,
It's
right?
not
If you're
sacrifice.
expecting to get better back, that's more of an investment.
So today our text comes out of Deuteronomy chapter 26. And before we read our text today, just a reminder, Deuteronomy is kind of the bookend of the Exodus story. So where Exodus begins the journey of the people from Sinai to the Promised Land, and they experience 40 years of wandering because of their inability to be brave and have courage and go into the land. A generation comes and passes along to a new generation. And Deuteronomy begins with a recommitment to the Torah, to the law, the Ten Commandments. And then God is preparing the people to go into the Promised Land. And Deuteronomy 26 reminds us that when the people get to the land of promise, that it is God giving them that land.
Right.
And their future generations may forget who has given the land to the people.
Tends to be how we work.
And one of the things when we think about our lives, or we think about everything around us, and you've mentioned it in several of our intergenerational podcasts, everything concerns God.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we have to be aware is that when we give back to God, what we're actually doing is giving to God what is already God's.
Yes.
And part of it is an act of faith into saying, God, you have given me more abundant than I need.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give an offering not only to you, but as we'll discover later, some of the things that is given takes care of not just the priest and the Levites, but also the poor,
right,
the widowed, the orphaned, and even the alien resident that comes and lives amongst God's people who may not have the things they need just to get by.
Right.
So would you read for us Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 1 through 11?
All right. Once you enter the land that God your God is giving you as an inheritance and take it over and settle down, you are to take some of the first fruits of what you grow in the land that your God is giving you. Put them in a basket and go to the place your God sets apart for you to worship him. At that time, go to the priest who is there and say, I announce to God your God today that I have entered the land that God promised to our ancestors, that he'd give to us. The priest will take the basket from you and place it on the altar of God your God, and there in the presence of God your God you will recite. A wandering Aramean was my father. He went down to Egypt and sojourned there. He and just a handful of his brothers at first, but soon they became a great nation, mighty and many. The Egyptians abused and battered us in a cruel and savage slavery. We cried out to God, the God of our fathers. He listened to our voice. He saw our destitution, our trouble, our cruel plight, and God took us out of Egypt with his strong hand and long arm, terrible and great, with signs and miracle wonders. And he brought us to this place, gave us this land flowing with milk and honey. So here I am. I've brought the first fruits of what I've grown on this ground you gave me, O God. Then placed it in the presence of God your God. Bow low in the presence of God your God and rejoice. Celebrate all the good things that God your God has given you and your family, you and the Levite and the foreigner who lives with you.
So as we hear the retelling of what God has done for God's people, Israel, of redeeming them out of Egypt, it is out of that they respond with sacrifice when they come into the land. So one of the things we're going to ask you to do if you do our Lenten devotion is to think about moments in your life where you felt God's goodness. This could include realizing God's love, a prayer being answered, or experiencing forgiveness, either with God or with others. But Kelly, can you think of a moment in your life that you go back to over and over again as kind of a reminder when you maybe feel low or maybe you feel like it's hard to give anything else?
Yeah.
That you go back and say, but this is how God has worked in my life.
Yeah, I think there's lots of those moments. But for me, one of the more recent would be when I came to Inman. I think that I had been here doing my interim, and I just knew that when I left, I shouldn't stay, after my first time here as an interim. And I just didn't have a peace about it to apply to be full-time here. And so I left for a year, and during that year, I remember thinking, like, did I make a mistake? Did I hear God wrong? Because I loved it. And I loved the people, and I loved the youth, and I was happy. And then, a year later, when I came back, it was like God was like, no, like, it was just a really a moment where I was just so grateful. It's very rare that lightning strikes twice. And so to be able to come back again and be in a place that I love and with people that I love was really a gift.
Mm-hmm. That's great. For me, it's kind of always that awareness is that in most of at least my health issues growing up and even today is that I've always been provided with the right people at the right time that know the right things. Having multiple heart surgeries and other things is that I've always been aware that God has worked through others to get me to where I am today.
Yeah.
And anytime I feel like, whether it's my health or health of a family member, is, even if things don't go exactly the way that we want, I am so thankful that we live not only in a place where we have health care,
Yeah.
but we live in a time that we do, that there is resources and things that, 5 years before I was born wasn't available, and I probably wouldn't have survived.
Right.
So for me, just being thankful that God knew when I needed to be born.
Yeah.
And has provided for me. And also just how the right people show up always at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm in my high or my low, somebody always sends somebody. And for me, knowing that God does that, I'm always on the lookout for who they are.
Yeah.
And so thankful that God sends the right people the right way, just like you coming to Inman. The right person at the right time. Well, when you think about sacrifice, Kelly, what are some things that come to your mind?
Well, I think, you were talking about parents, and I can remember growing up and never understanding, my parents never had, we never had new cars. We never, except, my dad, he had a work car. So that was always our new car, was whatever they had given him to drive for work. And I remember never understanding why we didn't have new cars. I mean, I was little, I didn't really understand about how much cars cost. And so I remember thinking, why? And one time my dad, we were talking, and he said, why your mom is still driving this car that barely works at this point in time, is because she would rather you have a safe car. She would rather you have a car that's not going to break down on the side of the road, and just realizing kind of in that moment how many things were like that, that she had worked part-time, not necessarily because she wanted to work part-time, but because she wanted to be home when we got home from school. I think she probably would have wanted to go further in her career, or she would have, wanted to make more money, and she didn't, because she wanted to be there for us in that way. And I think that's a beautiful picture. Like you were saying, parenthood always brings out sort of that unconditional sacrifice. So
one of the things I think about sacrifice is, thinking about Israel here in Deuteronomy, but thinking about my own life, is that the first time I have to give something up, it does feel like a sacrifice. The first time that you say to yourself, I'm finally making my own money and I want to give a tithe or offering.
Yeah.
And you look at what you have and you say, this is really going to be hard. And the first time it is hard, and it does feel like a really big sacrifice. Like, I don't know if I can live without this.
Yeah.
But the more I've done that in my life, the more I realize it becomes less about feeling like I'm giving up something I need, and more of a sense of not only God's generosity towards me, but that what I have, I can give generously to others. This morning I ate at Granny's, and there was a little older lady. I don't know how old she was, but she was
careful.
older. She was older, probably in her late 60s, early 70s. For those listening, that's older to me, younger to others. And she had her grandson there, and he was right about 1 year old. And he was just the cutest little thing, and just kept kind of staring towards me and the table I was at, and she was just so sweet to him. And I thought about, this woman has gotten up and taken care of a 1 year old child.
Right.
For one reason or another. Maybe she's watching the child for her daughter or granddaughter or grandson or son. But whatever she's done, she's brought this child out. He's eating breakfast with her, and it was a beautiful thing. And for some reason, it hit me, let me pay for their breakfast this morning. And for me, it wasn't a sense I'm sacrificing something. I saw her generosity towards her, this child. And it just hit me, let me show my generosity. I think for me, the more that you are generous with what you have, and it goes from feeling like sacrifice to wanting to do it.
Right.
That it becomes more of a sense of, I become more a reflection of what God has done for me.
Yeah.
We think about what God has done in Christ on the cross, and we do see it as sacrifice. But we also begin to see it as God's generosity.
Yes.
Jesus' generosity to not only go places that we wouldn't go, but to also, as he's going, not fighting, offering forgiveness. And for me, that's a sense of Jesus, even at his worst moments, was still giving generously to those around. When we think about sacrifice in terms of what we can do as individuals, what does that look like in terms of the church at large? So I want us to think about for a moment, each of us that are part of church, in many ways are called to give to the church, give of our time, our talents, our treasure, our resources.
Yeah.
And that can feel at times daunting.
Yes.
But what happens when each of us give out of our abundance to a larger good, a larger community? One of the things I'm reminded of is how little I would be able to do if it was just up to me to do what Inman First Baptist Church does.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's important to remember that, our combining all of our efforts, makes a bigger impact. But I also think that it's important because when we think about God and we're like, okay, well, if I sacrifice this, God doesn't need this. I always think about, two passages in the Bible that are, different than this one, but are when they would take their offerings and burn them. And the idea of like, what would that do to your heart if you took your first fruits, the best thing that you had, and you put it on an altar and then you just burned it up? Mm-hmm. Knowing that God doesn't need those ashes. And then, and thinking like, okay, well, what is the point? Mm-hmm. And realizing that the point of sacrifice is not that God needs our little bit so badly. It's more that it transforms us. Yeah. That when we can say, I will give you the very best of what I have, and I'm not asking anything back. That is like obviously a huge illustration when you're like, oh, well, we're just going to burn it in front of your face. But, even saying that where it's like, I'm giving this to this mission or this organization or the church or whatever, and I don't know what's going to happen with it. And like, that's okay. There's a piece of like a huge piece of trust in that. And then there's also a piece of like, what I'm giving you is not as important to me. Yeah. Right. That what I am possessing is not possessing me. That's true. And so I think about that. And then also the passage where David is doing a sacrifice. You guys are talking about David in Monday morning Bible study. Mm-hmm. But where he is wanting something to sacrifice, and the man says, oh, well, I'll give you this. Like, you don't have to buy it from me. You're the king. I can, give this to you. And David says, I will not give to God that which costs me nothing. And I think about that often. Actually, that passage I think is so powerful. Just that one phrase, and the idea that like, okay, what I give to God, does it cost me anything? Is it just in the overflow? Yeah. Is it like, okay, well, I've got what I need and now I can give whatever else to God? But, David is saying like, no, like what makes it worth it is that it will cost me. It will. And so I think about that often when I think about sacrifice.
And sacrifice can cost, it can hurt. If we give our time to other people, that means we have less time for ourselves. And sometimes that, you can overdo or underdo some things. One thing when I think about sacrifice, I don't think most people think about it, and maybe it's something that maybe some of y'all that are listening will. But on Sunday mornings, we stand up and sing. And in worship on Sunday mornings is the only place you will ever find me singing out loud in front of other people.
I never thought about that, but that's true. I've never heard you sing out loud any other time.
Any other place that I would do that, I would feel like, I don't know, goofy, silly. I would be embarrassed. Mm-hmm. But on Sunday mornings, I'm giving it not to the people around me. Yeah. I'm giving it to God. Right. And for me, that becomes a sacrifice because I normally wouldn't do that in front of anybody else. Mm-hmm. Maybe my daughter, maybe my wife in the car. Yeah. But I'm not a kind of person that's going to sing out loud other places. Sometimes when we look around and we don't see people, engaging in that act of worship, for me, I want to say, just do it. Right. Does God not deserve our voices as much as God deserves other things? Mm. And for me, that becomes a sacrifice. I don't always enjoy singing out loud. Yeah. Even in worship. But I do it. And I try to do it with a sense of awe and wonder. And it's a holy moment because I'm giving to God something that, let's just be honest, nobody in the world really wants. Nobody else wants me to sing to them, but God does. And for me, that becomes a part of worship.
That's a great way to look at it. Even just reading the text, in worship, we're participating and, sharing our stories and our testimonies and things like that it's hard. Yeah. It's very personal. It's very vulnerable, and it's embarrassing just to talk in front of people. I mean, reading words out of the Bible, sometimes they're very hard to read. Yeah. But the willingness to get up there and say, I'm going to do this anyways, because this is part of my worship. This is part of my sacrifice. I love that.
Thank you. One other thing I've thought about is the older we get, sometimes we feel like we don't have time for our parents. You ever felt like that? Mm-hmm. And the reality is that think about when we were children, how much time they spent on us.
Yeah.
And for God, oftentimes we don't realize how much time God has invested being with us. And as adults, one of the sacrifices we can give God is to make intentional time to be with God. And that can be a sacrifice because it could mean that we're not, working more, we're not spending time with doing Netflix.
Yeah.
But finding time in our day that we actually spend intentional time. It may be as if we are, making sure to connect with our adult parents, whether we're sending a text, making a short phone call, but just letting them know that we love them and care for them. In the same way, the older we get, the more mature we should be in making sure that we're intentionally spending time with our Heavenly Parent.
Yeah, I think one of the hard things about that is the letting go, sacrificing, if you will, the idea of productivity.
Yeah.
Right? That if I am spending an hour sitting and praying or listening for God, which is so hard, I don't feel like I'm getting things done.
Yeah.
It feels like a waste of time. I mean, it's not, but it can feel that way. Yeah, I think that's hard.
Well, this week, as you go throughout your week thinking and reflecting on our Lenten devotion, this text will be a part of our worship for our first Sunday in Lent. I want you, as our Inman First Baptist podcast audience, to think about ways in which that you are offering back to God what God has already given you. As Israel is looking at the land to which God has given them, they respond by saying, it doesn't belong to us, it belongs to you. And here is an awareness that we're going to do together, not only to give to you, but every third year they would also be commanded to give to the Levites and the alien residents and others within their community that needed it. Every third year, the year of the tithe, give 1/10 of your produce to the Levite, the foreigner, the orphan, the widow, that they may eat their fill in your cities. And one of the things we're aware of is that when we sacrifice, we are not just giving to the church at large. We're not just giving our time, our talent, our resources, but we're giving it to those within our community that are in need, whether that's through our Corner of Hope, our benevolence, Threads of Hope, pocketbooks full of hope, backpack. All of it goes towards those within our community that need to know the good news that we know.
Yeah.
Just like Israel retells the story of God's salvation, we are telling the story of salvation in Christ Jesus through this season of Lent, getting to Easter. Mm-hmm. And that is of a new life. And that's what Israel is getting in the promised land. They're getting a new life out of the death they felt in Egypt.
Yeah.
And the wilderness. And we've been giving new life. And how do we share that new life with those within our community? And oftentimes it means that we have to sacrifice something. But it also could mean that we are offering generosity.
Yeah.
Because God is generous to us. Any last thoughts, Kelly?
No, I just think that it's thinking about, like what you were saying, that like what God has given to us was never ours to begin with. And if we can take that in, then all of a sudden the sacrifice is not as big because it was never ours.
Yeah.
We're not giving up something that's ours. We're just giving back to God what is God's. And not even giving back because we're just stewards of it. It's like holding someone's money and then giving them back their money, So.
And I love what Jesus says to most of the people he encounters through the gospel. Very rarely does he meet somebody like the rich young ruler who he says to sell everything.
Right.
Normally Jesus says if you have 2 of something, you can't wear 2 coats at one time, Jesus says. If you see somebody that needs a coat, give one of the coats that you aren't wearing to somebody that needs it.
Yeah.
And in many ways, Jesus is just asking us to give out of our abundance. And out of our abundance, we aren't necessarily impoverishing ourselves, but we're helping somebody else who's probably somebody we know or somebody that lives near us to just be a little closer to where we're at.
Yeah, and to consider what we need.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would be like, I need 2 coats. I've got to wear one when it's really cold and one when it's not as cold, Yeah. But the reality is like what we think we need and what we really need. They're 2 different things.
They are 2 different things.
So.
Well, have a great week. We look forward to our next podcast with everyone. Join us for Ash Wednesday, for every Sunday through Lent. We will get together and worship, and I hope that I will hear you singing this week.
Yes, and the Lenten Journey on Wednesday nights.
That's
Please
right.
join us.
Please join us on Wednesday nights for some good food and some activities to help spur our imagination.
Yes, and prepare us and our hearts for Easter.
Thank you.